Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. A'udhu billahi minash shaitan ar-Rajim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yusuf Ponders, and we're going to be going through 4 lectures, today being the first of them. So let us begin. First of all, just by introducing myself. So like I said, my name is Yusuf Ponders. I have a YouTube channel which goes by the name of Pondering Soul. There's a website related to that as well, ponderingsoul.blog. With regards to myself, I'm trained in philosophy, so I have a BA in philosophy with a specific focus on the subjects of things like nihilism, which was the topic of my dissertation, and with other things such as ethics, etc. I did a lot of work on philosophers like Martin Heidegger, a lot of the other existentialists like Albert Camus, Kierkegaard, and I'm also a big fan of phenomenology and did work on famous philosophers like Kant as well. So the general focus of my expertise is quite broad. I also did a series with Sabur Ahmed from the channel Darwinian Delusions on the subjects of my dissertation. Basically, I think we did like 8 episodes, going through it bit by bit, reading it together and giving our commentary and having a sort of back and forth. So if you want to watch that, there's a playlist on my YouTube channel. That was the dissertation was part of the further reading that I think Brother Hamza put on the Sapience Institute website for this set of lectures. So if you already read that, then it should help you or give you a bit of background into what we're going to go into today and in the forwarding lessons. But if you didn't, it's not too much of a problem, because I'm hoping to kind of cover a lot with these lectures independently. Inshallah, they should be enough for you if you're watching them without having to do any of the other reading. There is also a new article that was published on the Sapience Institute website, which is again looking at nihilism but from a different angle than what the dissertation was specifically. The dissertation took this sort of path through what is nihilism, and then looking at like a comparison between Albert Camus and Kierkegaard on the subject of the leap of faith, and then moving from there into an analysis of a philosopher called Viktor Frankl, who was a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. But it's a topic that very much interests me, and this is one of the main reasons why I'm going to be covering it a lot here. So like I said, lecture 1, we're going to be going into what is nihilism. We'll go through the separate aims of today in a moment. Lecture 2 is going to cover what are the causes of nihilism, which will be next Monday. Lecture 3 is going to cover the consequences of nihilism. So once nihilism is sort of settled in, or once like a society or a person or people are affected by nihilism, what are the kind of outcomes that you could expect from that? And then lecture 4, inshallah, is going to look into Islam as a potential antidote to nihilism, and we'll kind of go through a number of things in that. But I'm not going to go into too much detail about what each of these future lectures will cover. We can do that obviously when the day arises. With regards to the lecture for today, there's a particular aim. So the first aim is to cover why nihilism is important. The second is to explore the question, what is the meaning of meaning? And the third, what is the meaning of life? And the fourth, what is the definition of nihilism? Now, I will begin with a quick exploration of the definition of meaning and nihilism, but we will go these into much more detail as we move through the lecture. The reason I'm leaving what the definition of nihilism is to last, because I feel it's important, first of all, to understand nihilism is the negation of the meaning of life. And so before we can talk about what nihilism is negating, we need to kind of have an understanding of what meaning is, what is the meaning of meaning, how that relates to life in general. And then I think only from there will it make more sense to explore the definition of nihilism, or the concept of nihilism, in a little bit more detail, with reference to a few quotes from some famous philosophers that really honed in on this particular idea or concept. So that's the reason why we're leaving that bit at last. I did a little bit of a practice round beforehand, and that was one of the comments or the feedbacks that I received. This should be done first, but it's just to kind of prep you all for the particular reason as to why I'm leaving this till last. So let me share my screen. So for those of you who are following, you should be able to see the screen now. Let's have a look. All right, so part one. Why is nihilism important? So I'll begin with two quick definitions. We'll just go over these very briefly. We will go into these in more detail in the parts that are going to follow, but it's just based on that little bit of feedback I got. I thought I'd give you like a sort of brief introduction. So when we're talking about meaning, we're talking about what is meant by something, whether that be a word, text, a concept, action, in general, what is implied, or the explicit significance of something, or another version of this is what is important or worthwhile, or an important or worthwhile quality, and it's with regards to purpose, and it's intended to communicate something that is not directly expressed. So that's a brief definition of meaning. With regards to nihilism, Merriam-Webster definition of this is a viewpoint that traditional values and beliefs are unfounded and that existence is senseless and useless. A doctrine that denies any objective grounding for truth, and especially moral truths. And the second definition here that's given is a doctrine or belief that conditions in the social organization are so bad as to make destruction desirable for its own sake, independent of any constructive program or possibility. So that second definition is more related to the Joker archetype, the character from Batman. It's that isn't to say that every nihilist is going to end up like a Joker, but it is one form that it can take. Although it's the most rare of them, this sort of outwardly destructive individual that just wants to kind of destroy everything for its own sake, independent of any constructive program or possibility. So those are some brief definitions of these. Hopefully that should give you a general enough an idea to sort of help with this whole question that we're beginning with. That is, why is nihilism important? Why should we bother looking into it, investing any time trying to understand this concept or understand this particular idea or problem? Now, with regards to myself, it's, this is anecdotal, but it's something I have experienced personally, and something that in the past and in waves every now and then is something I've suffered from greatly because of. So that is the experience of nihilism. It sort of hits you like a wave. It's not necessarily something that people rationalize, and it can be characterized as a sort of illness or a sickness to a certain degree, in that it doesn't even necessarily follow as the conclusion of a number of reasons or premises. It can just be the consequence of being overwhelmed, or the brain wanting to shut down because there's too much going on in life. And you become pessimistic, and you just sort of pessimism, well, as we see when we go through it, pessimism is this looking at the world in a particular way and taking the worst possible outcome or prediction of the world, and basically having a very, very low expectation. And the consequences of all of this is this feeling of nihilism, not necessarily, like I said, this conclusion, but it's an experience that can be related to depression and suicide, although not all nihilists commit suicide, not all nihilists suffer from depression. There are some academics, for example, that argue for it in a very positive way, although I think they are rare. The people who look at nihilism in a positive outlook, I would say, are as rare as, say, the destructive Joker type. That cartoon character bad guy. They're as rare as each other, but for the most part, I think people that are suffering from nihilism generally tend to experience low moods, depression, maybe even going as far as suicidal thoughts. Although, like I say, it's not necessarily. And this is a problem that is worldwide. So it's not just atheists that suffer from these feelings of nihilism. Especially with the work that I've done, I've had many theists, be they Muslim, Christian, reach out to me and talk to me about their feelings or their experiences of nihilism in general. And they follow this similar pattern. It's generally accompanied by very low moods, not really feeling that there's any purpose to their particular life, although not necessarily always branching out as far as to say that the universe has no purpose, or it doesn't follow that from this they're saying or trying to negate the existence of God. And in many cases, people who are experiencing this still believe in God, even though they're having these feelings of like a nihilistic tendency. But like I say, it is something that I'm very motivated to look into, simply because I have experienced it myself. I know how bad it can feel when you're sort of overwhelmed by these kind of feelings. And I do want to contribute, inshallah, to sort of helping people that have gone through or are going through or know someone who's going through similar things, to be able to overcome them. It's not nice when you're sort of stuck in this tar pit of mental thought or attitude. So that's the main reason why I think it's important, personally, and I think you should also think it's important for some more reasons, which we'll go into now. So I guess one of the questions we may ask at the beginning is, why is it so important for us to know whether or not our lives have any meaning? Is it really essential in order for us to go on living? That is, can someone just not bother even looking into these subjects and just plod on? Historically, I think it probably was more possible to not even have to ask these questions. Many people, say a few centuries ago, would simply just be born into a particular family, and there'd be sort of certain expectations in terms of what they were going to end up doing in their lives, what kind of job they were going to have to work with, and things like that. And these were generally decided by the conditions they were born in. Nowadays, it's much more likely that people are going to have to ask these questions themselves, because of the fact that there's all these questions that arise. What am I going to do with my life, etc., etc. So it's the world isn't necessarily deciding what you're going to do as much. We have more freedom to sort of pick for ourselves, and this is increasingly so around the world, although again, not necessarily for everyone. There are still many places in the world that still don't really have much choice in terms of what their future outcomes are. But those who are suffering from nihilism, I think, generally are at the consequence of a modern predicament, insofar as these freedoms increase, the burden of choice is upon them, and they've got to look at the world, evaluate it, and try to figure out what they're going to do. And there's a number of problems that coincide with these issues, or this phenomena, that has been sort of more explicitly a problem of the modern day in, say, the first world countries where these sort of issues are more prevalent. Now, there's a particular philosopher of great interest in these subjects, and that is Martin Heidegger. Controversial character in his own right. Don't need to go too much into detail about him in particular, but he wrote a great book called Being and Time, and in this he's basically following on from his predecessor Edmund Husserl, in continuing this what he referred to as phenomenology, or the phenomenological project. And in short, phenomenology is to basically to explore what was referred to by Husserl, quote unquote, the science of consciousness, which I guess in a looser way, could be referred to as the science of subjectivity. That is to explore the mechanism of consciousness, of experience itself, and try to get to understand consciousness as it's experienced in a more systematic way. Now, Heidegger, he asks a number of questions in his projects, and one of them is that what is it that makes the human being distinct from all of the kinds of being? And he even, weirdly enough, he ends up kind of exploring in another term. He refers to it as Dasein, which is German for being there, which does reference the human being, but it doesn't limit it to that. It's basically to describe the kind of being that the human being is. That is, that it's a being where its existence is a problem for it. It must decide how to be. That is, like, how am I going to exist? What kind of being am I going to be? Am I going to be a doctor? Am I going to be a philosopher, a YouTuber, an influencer? Am I going to work in the local grocery store? Am I going to be a mechanic? All of these questions are questions I'm going to have to ask. What kind of being am I going to be? And it's not just in relation to the sort of occupancy that a particular person might take on, but with many things. So, for example, your political persuasions. Am I going to be more left wing or right wing or more central? Am I going to try to transcend this modern paradigm? Am I going to make something new? In terms of religion, like, for example, myself, I went through this process. What am I? Am I an atheist? Am I an agnostic? Am I a Buddhist? A New Age? A Hindu? Or am I a Christian? A Jew? A Muslim? What is it that I wanted to be was a really, really important question. And I think the fundamental thing that I really wanted to explore in my younger age. And so I had to reach out. I had to look into all of these different things and figure this out. And that exploration was a result of these kind of questions. How am I going to exist? What kind of being am I going to be? Now, this is definitely distinct from the animal kingdom. Now, although you might be able to hold a certain attribute of the human and say, well, it looks like this particular species in the animal kingdom seems to express that attribute or that quality, like the human does. But I would always argue with regards to this that you may find these in much lesser quantities or much lesser, to a lesser extent. But the human being always excels in many of these areas. So in terms of like changing its environment, you cannot compare what the human being does to its environment to everything else in nature. You look at nature, you look at how a beaver may make a dam, for example, or how the ants may make a burrow or a hive or whatever it is. How all these little creatures shape or morph their world. They do change it, but not to the extent that the human being does. The human being completely levels where it lives. You look at a city, and it bears no resemblance to the land that it sits upon, and what it used to look like prior to that city's existence. We completely reshape the world around us in very unique and peculiar ways. And that's just one aspect. In terms of the human being, you look at the complete variance in the kind of being that you can have, from the different shapes, sizes, and etc. The different ways that a human being can be presented. It's mad how much they vary. Whereas if you look at like animals or particular species of animals, you don't see as much of a variance as you do with regards to the human being. It's the extent is mad. Now, with regards to animals, they don't seem to need to figure out the meaning of life either. And this is a peculiar thing. The fish doesn't have to figure out what kind of fish it's going to be. It just seems to simply exist. Same for the lion. There doesn't seem to be too much thought in terms of how it's going to exist. They seem to be very enveloped in the moment. There doesn't seem to be too much future planning going on. And the only time you really see them really kind of suffering from extreme depression is when they've been isolated or captured and put into captivity. And then you see these sort of effects that you might look at and characterize as depression. And there's certain studies going in now into whether or not animals commit suicide. But there's a lot of debate about whether or not that actually is suicide. And in any case, even if it is, animals do not commit suicide to the extent that the human being does. So there is a distinction here between the majority of the animal kingdom in terms of how they exist, what kind of being they are, and the human being, which you could categorize it basically as being self-conscious or self-aware to a much higher degree than any other species that we have on record. Now, I can't help but reflect on the meaning of life and on my purpose and function in society. I can't help but reflect on, you know, the meaning of things. And I think many people, like I said, in today's society, are having to deal with these same issues. They can't help but reflect on these issues. Some people might put this off, bury their head in the sand and try to put it off, but I would argue they may not seem to feel like they need to do it now, but at some point these questions will arise. At some point, maybe when it's too late, maybe when death is approaching and they're getting old, they might ask, what was it all for? What was the purpose of all of that? Why did I bother doing everything that I did? They might question this and be filled with regret and guilt. But that questioning is still arising. And obviously, if it arises earlier on in life, the better, because there's not as much to be regretful about, and they still have a future, for the most part, for those who have a long life ahead of them, to look forward to. There's a lot of change that can take place. For those who put it off and put their head in the sand, as they get older, that future shrinks, and you know they're fully aware that there's only a certain amount of time. We are finite beings with a finite amount of life, but these questions are always going to arise. You know, if life is taken away from you before you've had the chance to think about it, I don't think that means that you were never going to think about it. You know, for example, if you die younger, if you were given the chance to live longer, I think inevitably these questions would arise. You know, if everyone had a large amount of time to live and you could see death approaching, but unfortunately not everyone sees death on its way when it is. And so that is usually the what's the word here I'm looking for, the exception to the case. Now, all of this requires reflection. However, this reflection can be a great source of pain and anxiety. That is, when you're exploring these questions, you have to explore yourself. You have to explore the nature of yourself. What kind of person am I? What kind of person do I want to be? Now, a lot of time, maybe what you aim at, maybe what you desire in terms of, you know, your own progress, that may very well seem to be out of your reach. It might appear to you to be something very difficult to achieve. You might not feel capable of doing that. You may be aiming too high, or you may just have a very low opinion of yourself. But either way, you know, exploring these thoughts, exploring these things causes a lot of pain for a lot of people. You know, they will suffer from anxiety when they look into this, when they reflect on themselves, on their own condition, when they think about death. You might get the odd person who doesn't, but maybe you could argue in this case they're not really thinking about it properly. You know, that is something we could debate about, I guess, as is everything. But I think for the most part, it's a safe bet to say that upon reflecting, you're going to suffer these kind of things. You're going to suffer anxiety. You're going to suffer guilt, maybe with regards to your past self, or shame in regards to your lack of will power, things like that, to sort of achieve the things that you really want in life. And that also might be reflective of fear of failure, fear of what people might say about you, fear of many things. But this all kind of lumps up into this idea of suffering or pain and anxiety associated with these issues. And one of the problems with this is the pain itself can and does lead to suicide. That is, people that suffer, and the more acutely they suffer, or the worse they feel when they go through these kind of things, the door opens for this as a possibility. And today, this is certainly a huge problem. As we can see here, it's all over the papers. We're very, very aware of this being an issue, and very much an issue even for our youth. We're hearing of people committing suicide younger and younger these days. I can't remember what the age was exactly, but I remember hearing or reading about someone who might not have even been a teenager yet having committed suicide quite recently, which is really, really sad to hear. And in terms of numbers, just to put this in perspective, globally, nearly 800,000 people die every year due to suicide. That is 800,000 people nearly are committing suicide, killing themselves. And, in more perspective, we've got statistics, I won't dwell on these too long, but you're much more likely to kill yourself than you are to be killed by someone else. You see homicide there is nearly half the rate of suicide. And suicide collectively is, you'd have to add maybe 8 of the ones at the bottom up together to even get close to the amount of people dying because of suicide. And to put that into more perspective, that's about the size of Liverpool. So imagine hearing every year a city the size of Liverpool has killed itself. And what's even more shocking is that for every one suicide there are anything from 2 to 4 people that have attempted suicide and failed. So that's another, for 2 to 4 Liverpools or a city as large as Manchester trying to kill itself and failing to do so. That's a significant amount of people, and that's very worrying. And I'm going to argue here that suicide, those who are committing suicide, although obviously not everyone who suffers from nihilism or anyone who associates as a nihilist is going to be necessarily depressed or necessarily suicidal. But I will argue that anyone who is suicidal is necessarily suffering from some form of nihilism. That is, they don't see life worth living. They don't see a purpose in their life strong enough to convince them to continue to live. In fact, it's the opposite. They see much more reason to end their life than they do see reason to live. And this has very nihilistic connotations. And so I draw a connection between that is suicide, and nihilism because of this. Now, it's not just the lack of meaning that can be worrying either. Meaning itself can be very, very dangerous. And what do I mean by that? So if we take into account some of the major wars that have occurred in history, think about Hitler, for example. What motivated him? What motivated Hitler and the German people at the time to do what they did? It was a severe sense of meaning. You just have to envisage, for example, that famous speech where Hitler stood on the podium and he's shouting and he's screaming and the people are cheering. You can see it. You can see that they're inundated with meaning, like they're oozing with meaning. The whole atmosphere is so filled with meaning you could cut it with a knife. They're almost suffering from meaning. There's too much of it. So much so that it pushed them to extreme things. They went out and they did terrible things because they saw purpose in it. They saw meaning in it. And that's just one example, but many people are willing to be killed or even kill for a sense of meaning. Meaning can be more important than life itself, be that their own in so far as they sacrifice themselves, or be that in with regards to others. You think of the atom bomb and the devastation that the atom bomb can cause. You think of Japan, it had 2 atom bombs dropped on it, and countless people were killed as a result of this. Now, what was it that motivated the pressing of that button? There was a function, there was a purpose behind that. They saw their own particular narrative as being one worth sustaining, so much so that it was necessary to end the lives of thousands of people to sustain that narrative, to sustain that life, which they saw with a particular purpose in mind. They saw that as incredibly valuable, incredibly important, and they wanted to sustain it. and this pushed them to crazy extremes. And so we've got this issue here with meaning. You can have in one extreme an extent of it, and it can cause you to do terrible things. And on the other side of the spectrum, you've got an absolute negation of meaning, no meaning whatsoever. And so meaning itself can be said to be very positive in many ways, but it can also be very destructive, and especially so when meaning is lost. And people end their own lives and that of others, for the sake of or the lack of meaning. So with regards to the nihilist, it can express itself in a number of ways. So you've got, as I mentioned before, for example, the academic nihilist, who might see it in a positive way, or they might be a bit of a pessimist themselves, not necessarily see it positively. But I'm reading some books at the moment where they talk about it in a like a chirpy way, which was quite surprising to see. But they do exist, so you can't deny the existence of that kind of nihilist. The other extreme is the typical Joker, who's very famous as a nihilist, and he's expressing nihilism destructively. That is, he just, what's that famous quote of his? Some people just like to see the world burn, and to help it along. And this is characterized by this sort of accelerationism, that is the will to the end. That is, you want to see the end of existence itself, and you want to help that along. There's some really good kind of archetypal bad guys that were also played in Final Fantasy IX. For any of you who played that, I think that the major boss was like, he kind of encompassed this idea. He wanted to end existence and make it so nothing existed at all, because existence itself was just the balance was outweighed in favor of non-existence as far as they were concerned. So that's one extreme, or the other extreme, sorry. And then you've got the middle ground, where you have sort of maybe the passive nihilist, who's just a couch potato, doesn't want to go outside the house, doesn't want to socialize, maybe involves themselves in escapism. That is, they just kind of watch mind-numbing things, play computer games endlessly. I think this would probably cover most of the nihilists. And then you've maybe got the more the self-destructive, that is, those who destroy themselves via suicide or self-harm, or those the outwardly destructive nihilists, that is, those who go out and cause trouble elsewhere with other people. So some of the famous what they call the school shooters in America, they wrote notes and things like that before they committed their crimes and ended their own lives. They also have this quite nihilistic tendency as well, and you see that in their writing. But there is a spectrum of how nihilism can express itself, and I think in most cases it's worrying, or it's troubling, and something that you wouldn't want to experience. You do have, like I said, the more optimistic nihilist, although I think this is an oxymoron, as we'll see. I think nihilism is generally associated with pessimism. So I think I've argued quite well here that this is without a doubt a serious issue that needs to be addressed. You can't just ignore it. You can't put your head in the dirt and pretend it doesn't exist, because if it doesn't affect you, it will affect someone at some point in your or their lives. Nihilism is something that should concern us, that is, all of us collectively, especially the Muslim Ummah, especially the du'at and those involved in dawah, and just the community members in general. You should be equipped in order to be able to deal with this in your community. You should be able to spot it when you see someone suffering from it. They might not even recognize themselves as nihilists. Many people have said to me they didn't even know they were a nihilist until they'd heard me talk about it. They didn't realize there was a concept associated with the things they were going through, and it was only after they'd experienced it and after they'd seen someone talking about it that they put two and two together and noticed that there was a name for the thing that they had gone through. And then obviously this sparked an interest, and they look into it a bit more, try to understand the issue. And so the issue of meaning here must not be neglected, and is one that we should be giving our attention to. And part two, we're going to go into what is the meaning of meaning. And you might notice that this is a bit of a strange question. So before we can ask questions about the meaning of life, or the lack of it. We need to understand what do we mean by the word meaning. But there's a problem here that some of you may have noticed. That is that there seems to be a presupposition of the word meaning in order to ask that question. How do you ask what the meaning of meaning is if you don't already know what meaning is? Because surely if you don't know what meaning is and therefore have to explore it in order to understand it, you shouldn't be able to ask that question. But we can. How is that exactly? Now, we appear to have a precognitive understanding of meaning. And by precognitive, that is, we have an innate or a built-in understanding of meaning without having to look into it, without having to explore it. It's very much a part of us from a very, very early age. You see children engaging with the world in a meaningful way. They understand things, signify things. They're expressing meaning when they're crying for the attention of their parents, when they're trying to communicate, even from like very early ages where they can't talk explicitly, but they maybe point at something. They understand that when they point at something and say that is suggesting some sort of meaning. That is that they're trying to communicate. They're trying to transfer some sort of information from themselves to that which they wish to interact with. That is usually their parents or the people that are caring for them. And so our engagement with the world is already loaded with meaning from the get-go. Our very structure seems to be wired in order to engage with the world in a meaningful way. And we can do that in simple ways with certain signs that don't necessarily or haven't necessarily been made with the intention of communicating some sort of meaning. For example, here with the image, you have a man, he's walking through the jungle and he sees some paw prints. He's familiar with what animal they relate to, and the paw prints themselves, they scream out beyond the paw print. When someone sees and looks at the paw print, their mind is led to the existence of a different kind of being that isn't present there in the experience, but exists beyond the experience. That is, the paw prints infer the existence of the tiger or the large cat that might be crawling through the jungle, through the tall grass, and you associate certain ideas with that. Certain action might be required. You might need to take care. You might need to be a bit more vigilant. You might need to run for safety. There's a number of things that might occur, but all of this is all indicated or signified by the existence of something as simple as an impression in some mud. You see it, and it signifies something beyond it. Now we can go further than that with our experience of more articulate signs that have been created or made with the purpose of communicating some sort of meaning. And you see this more readily in the experience of books. Now, there's a weird thing that can occur with books, either like it is most of the time, and like it is when we were reading, for example, the definition of meaning. When you're engaging with a book, for the most part, the book itself should, if it's a good book especially, should just disappear. You're not even noticing the book explicitly. You don't notice the individual letters, nor do you notice the ink on. You don't notice it as ink on paper. What you're doing is you're engaging with these ideas. So you're just reading it, and you're reading it in a way where the words dissolve and disappear into the peripheral, and you're imagining what's going on there. So if you imagine, if you're reading Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or whatever it is you're into, your mind is actively engaging with this narrative that's going on. You've got this adventure happening. You've got people saving someone's lives or battling some devilish creature, and your brain its intentionality is focused. That is, it's directed towards the object of the experience, whether that's in the mind or if you're focusing outside and you see something that's endangering your life. Your mind is always focused at something, but that something doesn't necessarily have to be outside of you. Like when you're reading a book, technically your eyes are pointed at the paper, but your mind is engaged elsewhere. Your mind is focused solely on the idea itself. And a similar thing happens when you're, I don't know how many of you experience this, but I'm assuming it's quite common, where you're driving to work, or you're doing something that you do so often that it becomes second nature, and then you zone out because you're thinking of something other than the thing that you're doing, and then you zone back in, and you're like, oh crap, I've just traveled for 30 minutes, or for however long I've been traveling. This has happened even when I've been walking. I've been turning corners, and I've been doing all of this articulate movement with my legs and my body and looking for things, and I've not even noticed I've been doing it because I've been daydreaming. I've been elsewhere. My mind has been focused on something completely different, and half an hour flies by, and I don't recall the journey. I don't recall the past 30 minutes. So it's the same thing. Your mind is directed elsewhere, and when you're engaging with a book, you're engaging with the meaning. You're no longer looking simply at the words on the paper. You're not recognizing them for what they objectively are. You're experiencing them as something else, something that transcends the page, something that transcends the physical. And we don't need to go too much into what I mean by transcend exactly. All we mean is that it's not simply to be found in that book. It's not simply to be found in the physical object, which gives rise to the experience. There's much more to it, and it goes beyond that. And this is very much what we're talking about when we're talking about meaning. Is this the signification of something greater than the thing that gave rise to the meaning. So here again, let's look at the definition. So what is meant by a word, text, concept, or action? Implied or explicit significance, important or worthwhile quality, purpose, intended to communicate something that is not directly expressed. So the street sign, when I see certain street signs, especially ones like, for example, the street that I grew up on as a child, I see that. I don't just think of the sign. I don't just think of this concrete road. I think that these signs are associated with a number of experiences. There's lives that were lived on these streets. There was relations, there was friendships, there was heartbreak, death, trauma. There was all sorts that went on these particular streets, and the sign is an expression of all that in this tiny little thing. And you look at it, and the thing just disappears, and all of this just bellows out from it. It oozes uncontrollably. It's not something you actively have to do. Like if you open a box, the box opens off its own accord, and all of these things pour out. Meaning does that. You see things, and things are associated with them that are not explicitly contained within the thing that gives rise to them. And so you see the similar words here, or synonyms. Sense, denotation, connotation, signification, import, thrust, value, validity, worth, consequence. These things are really, really interesting. And the idea of meaning itself is an incredibly important one that I could talk about for years. But another important thing to hone in on here is we cannot talk of meaning without reference to some sort of subject, or that is life. That is, when we ask if something is meaningful, we must ask to who. Is it meaningful to me, to others, to God? It doesn't make sense to talk of meaning without reference to a being that recognizes it, without reference to something with some sort of consciousness, with some sort of awareness, because meaning is related to these concepts of signification, intention, purpose. All of these things are conscious practices. They require some form of consciousness. And so any discussion in terms of what meaning is to talk about a subject. That is, it is to talk about something related to subjectivity, but not in the sense that it's commonly used. Subjectivity, you find it from characters like the Richard Dawkins type, or the New Atheist in general, where they use, and many duat as well. I see this very often with many brothers I know and love. So I mean no disrespect from this. I just think it's a modern problem that we've made the word subjectivity synonymous with false, with not true. And there's much more nuance to this subject. than to simply relate it to that idea. If something is subjective, we need to disregard it. If something is subjective, it's something of little importance. We don't need to focus on it in any way. I think this is a huge mistake and a massive oversimplification of the idea of what is subjective. And then often objectivity is just related to this idea of truth, or that which should be absorbed or accepted or acted upon, and things like that. And again, this isn't necessarily the case either. There's much more nuance to it. These are not objective, subjective are not synonymous with true and false. There can be layers of things. There can be a layer of subjectivity, and then discussing objectivity with regards to subjective things. And then you've got issues of approaching the objective, because we're finite things. When we're looking at objective things, we can't help but perceive them in our own subjective ways. So even when you're looking at the objective, what that means exactly to the people that are engaging with it can often mean varying things. Obviously, that's not the case with absolutely everything that is objective. Like, for example, the speed that a car is going is a particular speed. You can't talk of that in a subjective way. But you can talk of what a particular set of data means. How should we understand this and interpret it? Does all of this information imply, for example, that there's no such thing as free will, or that there's no such thing as a self? Many of these things are still up for discussion. And insofar as we've not come to concrete answers about them, then this is where the subjectivity creeps in. Whereas when people are talking about it, you'll hear Sam Harris, for example, he'll talk about the fact that free will doesn't exist and the self is an illusion. And he says this as if that is itself a fact that's been established, even though there's a clear discussion going on into this, and his arguments have been shown to be extremely problematic by a number of philosophers. But this we don't need to go into this too much, but I'll just give you some examples. So we can say objectively that these symbols are infused with some sort of meaning. When I've said this to someone before, and one of the responses I got back was, maybe they're not necessarily implying meaning, maybe they're just trying to express beauty. In this case, I would argue the beauty itself would be the meaning. That is still to suggest something other than itself. And we look at these things that the people that wrote them had long gone. Generations and generations have passed. We could barely, if you just stumbled across these in the desert and had no prior knowledge to them, and you'd had no communication with anyone who knew anything about them, there's so many thousands of years distance between you and the people that scratched these into the walls or painted these onto fabrics or tablets. But you see and you recognize there's something going on here. You don't just see ink or scratches. Like for example, if I accidentally spill ink onto the floor, or if you see an oil spill, you're seeing a similar thing. You're seeing one thing of one sort of substance or of one quality on top of another thing. You see ink spilled on the floor. You see oil in the ocean. And there's a huge distinction between the colors of these things, and one thing stands out over the other. Here you've got a similar thing. You've got ink on top of something else, but it doesn't strike you as an accident. It doesn't strike you as without purpose, without meaning. It's clearly trying to express something. It's there's all sorts of ideas associated with this. These people relied on these particular animals, for example, for food. Or maybe they had them as pets. I don't know. There's the people expressed in them. When the person was drawing that, did they, was that representative of a particular character in his life? Like, was this, for example, a picture of his dad having a special bonding moment with a particular giraffe, or was this a hunter that he knew, a brave warrior that was out looking for food? Like, what are these? What do these mean exactly? We ask these questions when you see it. You can't help but think. And there's an interesting bit. So if you look to the left-hand side of the man's leg, this is strange because there's two things there, and they're kind of ambiguous. Are they kangaroos or ostriches, or are they just parts of the rock, accidents that happen to look like animals, and you see meaning in them. So you've got this variance of things when you're experiencing things that are clearly signifying something, things that are ambiguous, maybe accidents that happen to look like something that may be intended to signify some sort of meaning, or things that just don't have any significance whatsoever or don't express meaning. But there are these things, and we can talk of them in an objective way, despite their being innately ingrained into the subjective. That is, there's a level of interpretation, but we can talk about what the possible variances in interpretation are. And insofar as we list these out, we're listing out the objective possibilities for interpretation. And so you have this relationship. The concepts themselves, for example, in order to come up with the idea of the subjective, you have to objectify the subject. You have to list out the qualities that are objectively the case, which make something subjective, and vice versa. In order to come up with the idea of the objective, there has to be a world in relation to subjects looking at it for these things to be distinct from the opinion of it. If you search the definition of objective, the word subject pop up in there. The idea of the subject is integral to the concept of the objective. And it is that which is separate from us. And then even how we come to objective facts, these are abstracted from intersubjective experiences. That is, a number of people experience a particular thing, and you brush away the things that are not common within those experiences, and you take note of the things which occur consistently through every experience. That is, you have a number of subjective experiences, you collect all of them, and out of that intersubjective information, you abstract objective information. So even the objective itself is derived from some idea or some concept or conception of the subjective, which is really interesting. And like I say, these things, I could look at photos like this all day. Like what are they? Are they just really bad drawings of men? Are they jinn? Like some people might look at them. I don't know if any of you have seen Ancient Aliens, but they look at these things and go, look, it's the Greys. They've got 3 fingers and these weird heads. Must be aliens. It's all incredibly interesting, but all of this is trying to convey something beyond itself. It represents more than simply scratches or ink on a wall. If something has meaning, it is grander than the thing itself. Another way of putting is this, that as an analogy, is words are to meaning like pictures are to places. For example, if any of you have gone to somewhere and experienced a beautiful sunset on top of a mountain, and you've got this environment around you, and as the sun sets, it changes the sky, and the clouds pop with these amazing colors that are just indescribable. And the whole experience itself is enough to send shivers down your spine. It's enough to fill you with awe. And you're just totally engrossed by the experience. And it's not just something in front of you. It surrounds you. You're enveloped by it. No matter where you look, there's beauty. And you're just struck by the sheer sense of it. That everything just screams out as incredibly significant in that moment. And, so much so that you think, I want this to last. I need this to last. I want to share this with other people, and I want to be able to look back at this and experience this feeling again. And so you take a picture or you take a video. But the problem is the pictures or the videos never fully encapsulate the experience that you had in that live moment. The picture itself is nothing compared to the place. But it is a signifier. It is something that when you see it, maybe it will lead you to the memory of the experience, but the memory is never equivalent to the experience. It's always a diluted form. It's always missing something. It's always lacking something that the direct experience contained. It's always a poor shadow of itself. And you can think of things like Plato's allegory of the cave here, the shadows on the wall as representations of actual reality. The pictures are representations of the things that they're trying to lead the mind towards. And the same thing can be said with meaning and words. You know, you take a look at the word door in many different languages. You've just got these different arbitrary noises we make. You know, in English we say door. In China they say whatever they say. In the Arab world, I don't know what Arabic is for door, but you know, each country has its own noise, has its own way of you move your tongue in a particular way, you make sound come out of your throat in a particular way, and a noise is made, and that is picked up by the people that hear it, and they associate that with something. Now, the noise itself is not what's important. It's the meaning. It's what was intended to say. That is the thing that is, when it's said, when someone is communicating these noises, they're hoping that whoever's hearing them isn't focusing on the noise itself, but focusing on what was the signification of it, what this was intending to say. And there's a really beautiful quote, one of my favorite quotes that I stumbled on a long time ago, and it stuck with me ever since, and I love sharing it. It's from, I can never pronounce his name right, Zhongxi, and he wrote this it's in a book called Chuang Tzu, The Inner Chapters. The quote is as follows: "The fish trap exists because of the fish. Once you've gotten the fish, you can forget the trap. The rabbit snare exists because of the rabbit. Once you've gotten the rabbit, you can forget the snare. Words exist because of meaning. Once you've gotten the meaning, you can forget the words. Where can I find a man who has forgotten words so I can talk with him?" So here, you know, in the same way, the fish trap, the fish trap serves a purpose. You know, you make the fish trap, or you use the fish trap because you've got a goal in mind. You want to achieve a particular thing. Same thing with the snare. You want to achieve a particular thing with it. And once you've achieved what you have, you can disregard the thing because you've achieved it. You've got the thing that you wanted. You know, you use the fish trap. You now have the fish. You don't need to focus your attention on that fish trap anymore. You can go away, cook, and enjoy your fish. Same thing with the rabbit snare. Once you've got your rabbit, you can forget about the rabbit snare. You know, maybe you might want a rabbit again in the future, but insofar as this, you know, in terms of the moment, once you've gotten the rabbit, your mind isn't constantly staring at the snare while you're walking away with the rabbit, while you're cooking it. You're not always looking. It disappears from your experience. You cease to give it any value, or you know, or any preference in the experience at all. And the same can be said for words. And many of you have probably come across this, and how frustrating it can be, especially if you engage on social media, especially things like Twitter, for example, where you say something and the person you're interacting with focuses so intently on the words you used that they completely miss the point of what you were trying to say. You know, they're so focused on the word and what they think it means that they don't grasp the significance of the words themselves and what it was that you wanted to communicate. And that it feels like there might be some sort of a wall here. And so with this quote here, where can I find a man who has forgotten words so I can talk with him? Where can I find a man who is focused on wanting to get to the core of what it is that I'm trying to say, and not simply just picking the words that I've said, and you know, not holding them in any relation to what I was hoping to communicate. So very briefly there, going over the meaning of meaning and concluding that, we can now ask the question, well, how do we relate this to life? What do we mean, or what is the meaning of life? Now, it's very difficult to say what is meant when discussing meaning in relation to life for many people. You know, philosophers have even gone as far as saying that it's a non-question, that the question is itself absurd and we shouldn't even be asking it. And you know, that's one way of answering the question, but definitely not the only way. There have been many books written on this subject, so many. You know, they come in the form of self-help books, you know, motivation books, YouTube videos, films. You know, the media itself is varied along with the content. The approaches, the answers that are given are incredibly varied. And they go from anything from two extremes, from incredibly vague in order to try to be extremely transferable to everybody on the planet, to anyone who picks up this particular book, can draw some sort of idea of what the meaning of life is, but it's so incredibly vague that it's not very practical or not very helpful in terms of the immediate. How do I change how I'm going to live or move forward? They're just very vague, elusive. There's many like Buddhist writings that are like this, where you're reading them and it's like, they're so ingrained in these oxymorons or these paradoxes, and they're just saying all these mad things without really giving you any specific answers. And it sort of leaves it open-ended for you to explore and try to decide for yourself. But it's so vague. If you're looking for help in it, it sort of directs it just back to yourself, and they try to get you to help yourself, basically, or to think about it and come to your own conclusions. But insofar as doing that, it's not very helpful in giving you the answers that you're looking for. The other extreme is being very specific. But if it's too specific, if it's too honed in on a particular context or circumstance, it's not very transferable at all. It's helpful, but only to a very few people. And so you've got these two variances in terms of how people might approach, in terms of literature or just material in general, with regards to this question: what is the meaning of life? Now, maybe it is best in some cases, rather than trying to say what the meaning of life is, rather to approach it in terms of what the meaning of life is not. And so there's a few things that I'm going to say that we can say the meaning of life is distinct from, or a meaningful life is distinct from, a number of things. For example, we can say a meaningful life is distinct from the concept of pleasure. And the reason we can say this is because we can think, or we can envisage, a life that is endowed with meaning or purpose, or someone who's experiencing life as meaningful, but that is contained with lots of suffering. So, you could imagine someone that is, they see the purpose of their life as one that is, and they're getting a direct and severe sense of meaning from the experience of saving someone, or putting themselves in harm's way in order to save them. And they may very well go through pain throughout their entire life, but this life may still be seen as meaningful either to them, or experienced as meaningful by the people around them, or the people that hear about their life. When you read books about people who've, for example, there's a really good example with Job alayhi salam. I think is Ayub is the Arabic version of it, but the prophet Job alayhi salam is one who's said to go through a lot of suffering in his life, and in that we are experiencing it, we're looking at it, and we're deriving a lot of meaning from it. This isn't to say what that is exactly yet. We've not answered the question, what is the meaning of life? But we still get a sense of this, even when we're looking and or experiencing lives filled with suffering. People still can derive meaning from that. And in many cases, the suffering itself can be a source of meaning. And so we can say it's distinct from pleasure, but we can also say it's distinct from suffering, because you could imagine a meaningful life filled with happiness or pleasure, but it's, again, not necessarily related to it. We can also say that it's distinct from happiness, because you can think of, obviously, if a life is filled with suffering, they might be filled with sadness as well. And so a meaningful life might not be necessarily associated to the suffering and pain, but it might still be meaningful. And if that is the case, then we can say that these concepts are distinct from what we mean when we're saying that a life is meaningful. We can also say it's distinct from any concepts of morality. You take Shaitan or Iblis as an example of that, or Hitler, or any of these archetypal bad guys. That they might be driven by a severe sense of meaning. They might experience their life as very meaningful, but have no sense of morality at all, or be amoral completely, or they may be the most evil people. You think of Iblis. He's set himself a very particular goal, very particular target, to lead as many people astray as possible. But he's driven by some sense of meaning here. He sees a point in what he's doing, and so we can say that a meaningful life may be a moral one, but it's not necessarily the case. And so we can say this concept is also distinct from it. Last but not least, we can say that a meaningful life may also be distinct from a logical or a quote unquote a rational life. Again, this isn't to promote any of these concepts. I'm not trying to say that we should negate all of these or we should seek to avoid them, especially with regards to logic. But we can imagine a life being experienced as meaningful that is completely irrational. And you see this even more so today than ever, where people are just they're trying so hard to live a meaningful life that they don't even care if they embody contradictions. But they're still experiencing it. They're still experiencing some sort of purpose in what they're doing, or some sort of they're experiencing meaning, regardless of whether or not what they're expressing is coherent or what they're expressing is consistent in any way. Or they may even express being completely fine with contradictions and pushing them forward openly and saying this is I don't even care. Like you get this very much with many of these postmodern philosophers. They're saying one thing and then they say something else. If that doesn't that undermine that, it's like, well, why should we value rationality at all anyway? Like, what reason have we got to value rationality? But they still, they still seem to be finding some sort of meaning in that. And so, yeah, we can imagine a meaningful life as distinct from all four of these things: pleasure, happiness, morality, logic. That isn't to say it's necessarily distinct. You can have a meaningful life with these things, but you don't need them in order to have a meaningful life. So the question is, what is a meaningful life? What do we mean when we say a life is meaningful? That is, we mean a life that has a purpose, a life that has a goal or an aim of some sort of significance. That is, that it communicates something of great value beyond itself to something living and something conscious. So remember, when we were talking about these ideas of significance, of value, of communication, of meaning, purpose, all of these words are necessarily associated with a subject. They are necessarily associated with consciousness, with life. And so when we're saying that it communicates something of great value beyond itself, in the same way when we were talking about the how the words lead the one that's experiencing them to think of things more than just simply the ink or the scratchings on a wall, there's an experience of transcendence in some way. That isn't to say you leave the planet or you go somewhere else, or blah blah blah. We're not talking in terms of that, but there is an experience of some sort. Without any reference to these concepts of subjective or objective, there is an experience of leaving that which is experienced and something else manifesting phenomenologically in the field of experience, or the field of conscious experience. So if I tell you all now to close your eyes, and I'm not saying this facetiously or anything, like actually close your eyes, and to imagine a sunset in the desert, and the sun setting behind the horizon, and then on the horizon you can see the camels walking across with the riders and the packs, and the wares that they're carrying, and the sun is setting right behind them so as to make them black silhouettes, and the sky turns an amazing varying amount of colors from orange to purple to and they're just infused in this beautiful way, and you've got this kind of sparkling of the stars above it. Now, when I tell you to close your eyes and imagine that, you're experiencing something, and it's a fact that you're experiencing something. We're not saying anything about what that experience is ontologically. How it exists is irrelevant. The fact is you're still experiencing something, and it's not physical outside in the world in the same way the cup is, but it's still an experience, and you're still having it. And what's giving rise to this experience is your it's related to another experience, that is the noises that you hear coming out of your computers or out of your phones. There's certain sound waves going through the air that make your ears vibrate in a particular way, that sends nerves and electrons running through the nerves in your brain, and your brain does something, and then it presents to you a phenomenological experience. You're having something appear to you. You can see it. If I tell you to recite Surah Fatiha in your head without using your mouth, without moving your tongue, you can do it, and you can hear something. You're having an experience still. And these experiences can be of great value or of great significance to the thing that experiences them. And when we're talking about a meaningful life, we're talking about a life which is expressing something, it's communicating something beyond itself, beyond the physical makeup of it, beyond just simply being a collection of atoms, but to communicate something beyond itself of great value to something living in consciousness. Now that can be from one person to someone else. So if you're listening to this on your own, I might be living my life in such a way so that if you ever hear of it, or if one particular person, maybe my daughter, I want my life to be significant or of great value to my daughter, so that when she thinks of my life in totality, from beginning to end, or when she thinks of me, that it communicates something great to her, or to you, or to anybody. And you may have this sort of desire as well, for your life to mean something to someone, or to a group of people. That there might be a crowd, a family, a neighborhood, a community that you've got in mind, or a city, or a nation, or a state, or the world, or to God. Now, obviously, keep in mind, these are ambiguous in the sense that you can be an atheist, you can be a theist, you can be a whateverist, like whatever it is that you are, these can still associate to you. Like you may want to express some sort of meaning to somebody to some degree, and that could be a huge project. Like for example, Islam, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was sent as a guidance for all of mankind. That is, his project, his life was meaningful, not just to one person or a group of people, or just to a city, just to Medina, just to Mecca, but to the whole planet. And for those who believe in God, and if it turns out we are right, a life can be meaningful insofar as it's directed towards this eternal being. And if God exists, and we're going to explore this, and there are with Sapience Institute, the whole project of this organization is to give an abundance of reasons as to the proofs and the existence of God, and why it's perfectly reasonable to believe that God exists. And insofar as we are successful in this, and God does in fact exist, then any relation with this eternal being would infuse life with meaning necessarily. Allah says in the Quran, do you think we've made this without reason? The purpose of the human being is to worship the one who made him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if God exists, there is necessarily a purpose to life. And so when we're talking of the meaning of life in this sense, you have this eternal absolute sense of meaning that subsists forever. If you have a more atheist understanding, that is the positive atheist, who says that there definitely is no God. Obviously, this isn't all atheists. Some are more agnostic. But insofar as that's the case, and you have this underlying principle that whatever gave rise to existence is itself unconscious, then you can't talk of life in its totality as being meaningful. You just have these fleeting moments of meaning. You could go as far as arguing that it's illusory. That the experience of meaning is insignificant. And if meaning is to have some sense of what is valuable or what is significant, but if the thing itself is insignificant and has no value, then this idea of that life being valuable at all is mistaken. But there's these brief senses of meaning, and they can be fleeting. And the realization upon reflection, if you believe that there is no God, the realization of this meaninglessness can be very daunting. And having been an atheist and having experienced this, and knowing people that do still experience this kind of stuff, it's a horrible feeling, especially when you don't believe, especially when you have no faith. I would say that although the theist can still experience this, it's never to the extreme, or it's never as horrible as it can be when there is no, or when you have the experience of the lack of faith. There is a huge distinction between the two. But yeah, so when we're talking about the meaning of life, we're talking in a general sense of a communication between two beings, A and B. B can be a set of beings, so it can be more than one, a collection. It can be the higher being, or it could be the same being as A. So you could literally just be trying to communicate some sort of meaning to yourself in some way. And so long as this is significant or of value to even of yourself, if you're a very self-centered person and you don't really care about other people or having an effect on anyone else, then this could be a sort of self-reference point. But in any case, this is what we mean when we're talking about the meaning of life. It's trying to project something of significance. We necessarily have to be talking about consciousness to some degree, and this all ties in to the following, to part 4. What is the definition of nihilism? So just to kind of recap on the definition I gave you at the beginning. Nihilism: a viewpoint that traditional values and beliefs are unfounded and that existence is senseless and useless. There's a quote here by Ronald H. Nash. Nihilism is the condition in which all ultimate values lose their value. Doctrine that denies any objective ground of truth, and especially of moral truths, and a doctrine of belief that conditions in the social organization are so bad as to make destruction desirable for its own sake, independent of any constructive program or possibility. Now, this is again a very general definition, and nihilism can express itself in 4 particular ways, which we'll go into with regards to the consequences of nihilism. And that can either be what were they again? So you've got existential nihilism, which is the experience of life being meaningless. You have cosmic nihilism, which is the idea that existence itself, that the cosmos, the universe, that everything is without purpose, without any meaning. You also have moral nihilism, which is to deny the existence of any moral facts. That is, any moral claim, whether positive or negative, that is, for example, murder is good or murder is bad. Both of these claims are wrong because they purport facts that do not exist. And so there cannot be any moral facts whatsoever. That would be moral nihilism, the denial of morality altogether, or a severe moral skepticism. And then last of all, you have epistemological nihilism, which is to do, epistemology is the subject of knowledge. How do we know what we know, etc. Epistemological nihilism denies the existence, denies the possibility of knowledge at all, denies the possibility of as it says here, a doctrine that denies any objective ground of truth. So truth is out the window here when it comes to epistemological nihilism. So it can branch out into these 4 more vague things. And here's a really funny definition I found. I really liked it. It's the most popular definition on Urban Dictionary. Nihilism: it's useless to define it, and it's useless to give an example. 5,220 upvotes, which is quite a lot of upvotes for a definition from what I've seen. I was saying that maybe the definitions I find on Urban Dictionary are not necessarily so what's the word, widely spoken. So basically nihilism, more specifically, is the experience that life has no meaning, has no significance, have no purpose, or any value at all. So nihil comes from the Latin, or it derives from the Latin, nihilism, derives from the Latin nihil, or nihil, N-I-H-I-L, which means nothing. So nihilism is, in a sense, nothingism. And it's literally the negation of any sort of meaning, any sort of value, significance, or purpose. And what's key here is to understand that it is an experience as well, and it is necessarily tied to life also. So whether life and the world is seen as meaningful, or, in the case of nihilism, not, both are subjective experiences. Both are the experiences of a being that is looking at the world and seeing it a particular way. Now, for example, if I see the world as a theist and everything to me stands out as meaningful, and the reason everything stands out to me as meaningful is because I believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists and that he creates everything with purpose, there are no accidents, there are no coincidences. Everything has a function, everything has a purpose, and this purpose is very much the case. You can't explain it away, and this is an experience I have. I look at things and I can't help but see everything as meaningful, as having a place, as having a purpose, even if I can't recognize what exactly that is. I still see it as an integral part of its existence. Now, the one who's a nihilist or is experiencing nihilism, it's going through a similar thing there, insofar as he's simply experiencing the world as being meaningless. And especially if you go into this idea of nihilism to its more extreme forms, where you can even deny the existence, the possibility of knowledge, you can't say for a fact that the universe is without meaning here. Nevertheless, the person is experiencing it, and insofar as they're a nihilist, they might even undermine the value of rationality, for example. And if they're undermining the ideas of rationality, then there's no need to be consistent. So what if they say that the world, the universe and life and everything has no meaning, has no value, has no significance in any way? Who cares if the way they've got there is contradictory in some way? So what? The world is absurd. They experience existence as absurd. And Albert Camus, in his book The Myth of Sisyphus, he goes down this route. He says the more you explore science and rationality and all of these things, the more you have the experience of the absurd. The more you are faced with contradictions. The biggest one being, like, how do you justify rationality? Especially if you're coming from zero iman, you have no faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you don't believe in God at all. You don't know whether he exists or not, but you just don't have an experience of belief in him. You don't feel that there's any need or enough sufficient evidence to believe in him, or like, things are just, there's too much chaos, there's too much information, there's no way you're going to be able to process it all, with your puny little brain in the amount of time that you have in your particular life. No way you're going to be able to cover all of that ground. And so you just kind of give up on the hope of that at all. That is, you fall into pessimism. You just say that, well, it's a hopeless endeavor. I won't even bother. Which is, what Camus sort of ends up kind of expressing in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus. And he says, everywhere you look, you find contradictions. You talk to the scientist, he tells you about the atom, and he starts talking in terms of these things floating around. You've got the electrons orbiting a nucleus, and the more and this is Albert Camus saying this in his book, he says the more you speak to the scientist, the more you start to realize he's expressing himself in terms of art. So what's he doing here? He's using metaphor to communicate something to you, and this for Albert Camus was a big problem. It's like you're using imagery that isn't necessarily associated with the thing that you're trying to describe. When you read the literature on this, and when I'm talking to you about an atom, everyone imagines a particular image. Now the thing is that image, that image isn't a one-for-one representation of what an atom looks like. That image is a metaphor. That image is just a way to try to communicate something to you. But in effect, as Nietzsche would put it, it's a lie. The atom doesn't look like that. And the scientist himself will admit, no, this is just a very pretty way to try to express what's going on there. But it's not a one-for-one representation. It's art. It's trying to communicate a complex idea in a simple way. And for Camus, this was incredibly annoying, and he gets to this point where he's just experiencing everything is absurd. Everywhere he looks, he just finds the lie. He just finds representation. He just finds paradoxes and conflict and things. And he, quite early in his life, because he died quite young in a car crash, living life to the fullest, I guess, quote unquote. He just saw this all as absurd, and he had what philosophers that have this sort of nihilistic inclination refer to as the experience of the absurd. This experience is said to be born of the conflict of two things, and they say so. The first is the natural human need and inclination for meaning and reason. So it's, quite, I would say, intuitive, and I don't think you'd find many people that would argue against this particular premise, but that, the human being does have a natural need and inclination for meaning and reason. That this is an innate part of our very being. It's integral, and part of the structure of what it means to be a human is that you have this need for meaning, you have this desire for purpose, for reason, for significance of some sort. We are attached to these notions of value. We can't escape it. And even insofar as someone becomes a nihilist and wants to, undermine notions of value completely, what they're doing is they've not ceased to value things. They've just begun to value nihilism. They've begun to value the ideas that are associated with this particular concept. So they've not managed to get rid of it. And then this is where the whole idea of paradox and submission to contradictions come in. It's like, well, so what? Like, why should I value reason? Yeah, again, you see there's very much being expressed in a lot of postmodern philosophies, where it's like this idea of rationality and reason is a social construct along with everything else. It gets rather confusing and sort of leaves people in utter chaos, in madness, in what's that? Alice in Wonderland. Everything's a bit weird, and I think that there is a certain amount that maybe everyone can at some point in their life come to experience this, where you become overwhelmed with the world and you have this experience of the absurd. Because again, here it says that the second element of this experience of the absurd that is born out of the conflict of two things. The first thing being the natural human need and inclination for meaning and reason. The second thing, and I've put emphasis on the experience of, again, so that you can remember the idea that all of this is associated to the idea of consciousness, the experience of the unreasonable silence of the world. That is, you look at the world and it fails to answer you. You don't get the answers that you were looking for. Maybe that might be because you have a high expectation of what you're expecting in terms of an answer. Maybe you're just missing them. Maybe, there's many reasons why it might appear to you to be the unreasonable silence of the world, or the world might appear to be silent. The point is, it's just an experience. You look at the world and you're not experiencing answers to these questions that you're having, and you find this unreasonable because you've got these needs. You can't get rid of them. Like, you've been born with a need for meaning and reason, but then when you look out into the world, you can't find it anywhere. This is the conflict. And so you get this absurd notion arise out of that. It's like, well, what on earth is this need? What's the function of this need if it can't be fulfilled? What's the function of desiring meaning and reason if I'm not experiencing any? Everywhere I look, I'm hungry for it. And like the one who starves, who searches for food, but only finds dust. The one who's at the end of this, the experience of the absurd, he's suffering from this same conflict. It's like, imagine being born in a world where there's just no food and everyone's just doomed to die from it straight away. It's this type of experience, and people get this, and I think a lot of the time as well, it's probably the consequence of impatience. People want an answer and they want it straight away. You have that meme of the stereotype of an atheist, which I always have to kind of make these footnotes or spoken footnotes where it's like, I obviously don't mean every atheist, but these memes exist. People are producing them, and the meme is that the atheist is just kind of like demanding an answer now. So he screams out to God in a very arrogant way, and he says, God, answer me now, otherwise I have no reason to believe in you. Give me what I desire, give me a golden toilet, and if you don't give me this now, then obviously you don't exist and I won't believe in you. And they're sort of giving God an ultimatum. Either he does this right now, exactly as I've asked. I want to see a miracle, without any question as to whether or not they're deserving of such a thing. or whether there might be a problem in the way that they're asking, whether they're not they're in a place where they can command the Lord of the universe. Like, in a way, you sort of imagine, this pauper, this like this scruffy man who's got no sense of self-respect, is rude to the world and everyone. Like he's like, his whole aim is just to be a miserable git, and constantly give everyone a bad time, call them names, and be a bully. And then he goes to the king that everyone loves, the king that provides for all his people, and and he treats them well, and all of his subjects love him. And then you've got this little idiot, with no etiquette and no self-respect or respect for anyone, and he just comes up to the king and starts demanding things from him. Like, what makes this particular archetype, or the meme of this stereotype of a small number of atheists, what makes them think in that moment that they're worthy of a response? But they don't get one, maybe because they're young, naive, impatient, and they're expecting an answer straight away. And sometimes your answers might come in a long time. Like, my daughter asked me certain questions, and I know she's not going to be able to understand the answer now. She's only 3. And so I'm like, you'll understand when you're a bit bigger. She wants to play chess with me. I'm like, you can't play chess yet. She's like, why? Like, you're just not going to get the rules. It's too complex. But she doesn't even understand the explanation as to why she needs to wait before she can understand. And so I've just got to kind of put it off. When you're bigger, which isn't an explanation. She's not getting an answer to the questions when she says why. She's being made to wait, and that requires patience. And one day, inshallah, she'll grow up, and she'll be able to play and understand the game, and we'll be able to interact through that. And I would say the same thing with regards to the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you ask questions, you won't necessarily get your answers straight away, but with patience you will get them. And with regards to nihilism, or the experience of nihilism, you're just not getting anything yet. That's not to say you're not going to get them in the future, but you're just, right now, I have no experience of them. And some, I would say, very hastily attach themselves to this unreasonable silence, and then compare it and look at it side by side with that first premise, that is the natural human need for an inclination towards meaning and reason, and they declare the experience of the absurd. They have it. They've got it right there. I have this urge, and it's not being satisfied right now. So I see this as absurd, and explain the experience that I'm getting of it. But let's explore a few quotes here, just kind of delve down into this idea from the perspective of the philosophers that have kind of inclined to this notion. So we have a quote here from Thomas Nagel in his article The Absurd, quote at the bottom there. And he says, "We step back to find the whole system of justification and criticism, which controls our choices and supports our claims to rationality, rests on responses and habits that we never question, that we should not know how to defend without circularity, to which we shall continue to adhere even after they are called into question." So you think of the old notion of rationality, as I mentioned to you before. How do you justify the notion of rationality without giving a rational argument? If what do we do here? Do we say rationality rules? That other atheistic cliche. They're not even just atheistic cliche, actually. You'll find many theists talk about this in the same way. Rationality rules. Everything must be able to be rationally explained. But then it's like, well, if you do that, how do we go about justifying reason itself without recourse to rationality? Because within the whole idea of rationality, circular reasoning is fallacious. So I can't justify reason with reason. I need to appeal to something beyond it. So I'm not finding myself in this circle, finding myself in this fallacious reasoning. So I need to go beyond it. What else have I got other than rationality? The things that, in saying rationality is the highest value, in saying that everything needs to be justified rationally, I've set myself up for ruin. How do I defend that without circularity? You can't. If you make rationality the be all and end all of all things, you completely undermine rationality altogether, Or you could just ignore that your foundation is based on this circular reasoning. But that you had to, in order to escape that, you had to appeal to something beyond rationality itself. And people struggle with that, especially if they've made rationality the highest value. Things like intuition are unsuitable, subjective. Here we go again. Subjective being equivalent with false. Intuition just being a bit absurd or vague. And what do you mean by that exactly? What about people who have opposite intuitions? They could make the same argument. I have this idea that rationality is complete an illusion, and this is my intuition. I don't need to justify that in any way because rationality is absurd anyway. So why bother? Blah 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 blah. But that there's not just that. There's all these different notions that are tied up, and he says here that this whole system of justification and criticism, which controls our choices and supports our claims to rationality, rests on responses and habits that we never question, and that we should not know how to defend without circularity. And you find this when you engage with these people or with anybody that holds this sort of mentality. The more you question, the more they sort of leave themselves, kind of chipping away at their foundation. Before too long, they end up feeling like they're floating in an abyss. They feel completely lost. They've got nothing to stand on anymore. You get this with atheists when you're engaging with them, but you also get it with theists who engage with atheists. Theists that hasn't really got a grounding in their own religion. They've not really spent much time preparing themselves for an engagement in any sort of apologetics. They go out there and they find someone who's maybe a bit more well-read, and that person just picks away at their foundations and leaves them without any grounding and feeling like they're floating. And you get this. I've spoken to ex-Muslims that have gone through the same thing, and it's equivalent to, like, for example, someone who's like, I want to be a boxer, and he's not trained in boxing. He's never fought in his life. He's never even exercised. He's a bit overweight, maybe. He's unhealthy. If he swings for a punch, he's more likely to knock himself out. And he goes, I know what I'll do. I'll pick a fight with the heavyweight champion of the world. That'll teach me. All that'll teach you is that you're an idiot. If you're gonna pick fights with heavyweights, you're gonna get knocked out. End of. And it's the same principle when it comes to engaging in apologetics. If you start picking fights with people way above your belt, then you're going to end up suffering from this erosion of your foundation, and you're going to be left with an abyss. And many people, when they're in that, they're feeling anxiety, like we mentioned at the beginning of this. They have feelings of anxiety, they have feelings of worry, and they just want to find a way out of that. One way of doing that is to appeal to the community you came from. And one of the issues with this is that when you move towards your own community with these doubts, with these fears, with these contentions, if the community isn't equipped to answer these contentions, which most people are not, especially if you're engaging with like the higher echelons of the academic world, or people that have training in this or have spent a lifetime reading on these particular subjects. If you just go to the average Joe, to your uncle, to your dad, who's just a mechanic, not just a mechanic, it's not to undermine the mechanics, who just basically don't have any training in academia or any training in answering these particular questions, they're going to struggle to answer them. And so what you often get, and I've seen this within the Muslim community, someone is showered with doubts, one after the other, so many that they can't process them, and they need help. They need to get answers to these questions, and there's too many of them, and their brain's been pickled. The assumptions that they had have been removed, so they're suffering from anxiety and all sorts of pain internally. There's all this angst, and you can't process information when you feel like that. You can't. If anyone has ever gone through the experience of going into an exam having not studied and going into an exam having been fully prepared, there's a huge distinction between the experiences of these two things. Those who go in having not studied, not learned anything to do with that, they go in anxious, a mess, they flop, they fail. They can't get the research, the revision, all of this, the training is, apart from the odd few super genius, for the most part, most people who go into an exam in that sort of condition are doomed to fail. Whereas those who go in prepared, go in feeling comfortable. And because they're comfortable, they're able to think and process the information that they're reading. They're able to engage critically with the questions that are being asked, and then to regurgitate the things that they've been learning about. Now, you can't do that if you just go out into the world. You're out on Discord, you're out on edgy YouTube or edgy Twitter, and you're arguing with people. And this is your first experience of these things. You're going to come across stuff that's going to make you anxious. And when it makes you anxious, when it makes you scared, am I on the right thing? Or, you know, what if I submit to this now? What if I go to hellfire? Or what if everything that I believed or been told to believe is wrong? And I've been living this lie my whole life, and everyone that I love has been living this lie. I might be ostracized. I might be this. I might be that. All of these thoughts, all these possibilities, all of this chaos, it just tears people apart from the inside. And if they don't have people they can approach and communicate with, this is a recipe for disaster. This is, you know, the beginning of nihilism for a particular person. It's not to say that they'll live through nihilism the whole life. Maybe they'll find some sort of way to transcend or escape it in some way. But it's there. It's on its way. And, you know, the community itself are given these questions. They don't know how to answer them, and they get scared themselves. They get anxious. I don't know how to answer that. They panic and say, "Oh no, have you? How dare you question? How dare you question God or ask these questions?" Blah blah blah. That make, you know, if you do this, you're a bad person. Blah 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 blah. But the person's thirst isn't satisfied. It's like someone that needs water and they're begging people for water, and they're you stupid, get away. How dare you ask for water? It's like, no, but I'm so thirsty, man. You got to give me something. But you know, the community pushes them away or makes them feel bad for even asking these questions in the first place. And so they become an outsider to everyone. They don't feel welcome in their own community. You know, they don't feel welcome in any community at all. And so they fall back on the people that gave them doubts in the first place. And those people say, we've got answers. And they give answers, and the answers, obviously, they're, for example, anti-Islamic apologists. The answers that they will give will be just, don't worry, what you were on was wrong, but we've got something better. And then maybe the person hasn't really got the ability to process everything they're being given. But the people are speaking it confidently. The people are speaking it without any sense of doubt in their voice or anything like that. And they become convincing. And so the people just adopt whatever it was that they were being told. So whether that's, for example, Christians, whether that be atheists, in many cases as well, I've even seen it with Muslims, where you've got a bunch of people, often very young teenagers. They don't really know anything about what they're saying. They've just memorized particular pathways through a discussion, and they're just going around and they'll undermine people's foundations, leave them feeling nihilistic or in a void, and then just talk to them confidently, maybe even giving bad arguments. And we saw this very early on in around the 90s and 2000s, or the early millennium, where, for example, the whole arguments with regards to the scientific miracles in the Quran. You still see remnants of this today, but there was many people that were brought to the folds of Islam through some very, very bad arguments. And then when it came to light that these were bad arguments, when they came to understand how they were fallacious in one way or another, they lost faith and they left the folds of Islam again. What use is there bringing people into the religion with these shaky arguments if, when they discover they are shaky arguments, it's only going to fall out of the folds again? And so, you know, this is just to kind of get a point across that this is prevalent across all communities, whether that be Muslim, atheist, Christian, Hindu, what's not what's where. You've got this phenomena where people, you question them on it, and you question far enough, and basically what comes to light is the finitude of the human being, how little the human being really knows, and how it can know anything independently without any sort of guidance, without any sort of help from something that may know. And if there is no God, if the universe is just this dead matter and the underlying foundation of it has no consciousness to it whatsoever, then, you know, there is no possible guidance. There is no way of being able to find truth. However, if God does exist and he does communicate with us and he is given us revelation If this information is coming from a being that is all-knowing, all-wise, then this would be the only true knowledge that we could ever get under these circumstances, insofar as we are finite beings, and independently, we only get ourselves in a stupor. We love to argue, we love to debate, but ultimately, we can only focus on so much. We only have a limited amount of time in life, and we only have limited processing power. And so, you know, if you take on so much information, there's only so much you can do with that before you'll die. And you'll find this is what's it called, the Dunning-Kruger effect, that whenever you have someone that begins to study a subject, they get confident at the beginning, but the more they study it, the more they lose the confidence, and then they sort of go right to the bottom, and then that confidence begins to increase as they become experts in the field. But even when you're talking to the experts, and you'll find this when you're speaking to the the ulama, the very learned, those in the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they talk in a very humble manner. They often make you hyper aware of how little they know in terms of what there is to know. The more you learn, the more you realize there is to learn. Every answer to every question gives rise to 20, 30, 40, 50 more questions. As the pile of things you know increases, so does the pile of things you don't know. And the pile of things sorry, it gets a bit of a tongue twister this part, but the pile of things you don't know increases a lot quicker, exponentially quicker, than the pile of knowledge increases. And this can be very daunting and very overwhelming for a lot of people, especially with those who have not practiced patience and perseverance and discipline, and just to kind of work through problems and not let these immediate feelings that arise when you experience certain truths, not to let them overcome you or overburden you, but to push on. And you get this. And so this here, this quote by Thomas Nagel is, although obviously I disagree with him on a lot of things, I find this quote itself quite profound, and there's a lot to take from it. Now, moving on to Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher who's famous for talking about nihilism. He says pessimism, this is aphorism 9 in his book The Will to Power. It says pessimism as the prototype of nihilism. So in here he's saying that basically there's an introductory stage to nihilism, and the first step of that is pessimism. That is the opposite of optimism. Now, what is it that gives, this begs the question, what is it that gives rise to pessimism, which leads to nihilism in the end? And the idea is that, as far as I can see it, that no one is explicitly an optimist, no one is explicitly a pessimist, but people wave in and out of these things. Sometimes someone can be too over optimistic, have too high hopes, and then these hopes become blown out of the water. It's not possible to achieve this, and because they set their hopes too high, they were aiming too high, unrealistically. When this realization hits them, they drop into the depths of pessimism. And insofar as they're in the depths of pessimism, the opportunity for nihilism begins to open. As Nietzsche says here, insofar as you're a pessimist, you are a prototype for the nihilist, or pessimism as the prototype of nihilism. Now in aphorism 11, he says, the logic of pessimism leads ultimately to nihilism. But what motivates it? The notion that everything is worthless, meaningless. The way that moral judgments lie behind all other high ideals. So this last bit here, the way moral judgments lie behind all other high ideals. Now Nietzsche, he talks in terms of a higher value undermining itself. So I think that in the next quote here, he actually says that. So nihilism, there is no goal. This is aphorism 2 in the same book. Nihilism, there is no goal, no answer to the question why. What is the significance of nihilism? That the highest values devalue themselves. So if we look back here again, so it says here, the way that moral judgments lie behind all other high ideals. So with this notion of truth, so you have with the new atheist kind of movement, people like Dawkins and things like that. They get truth is the highest value. We need to achieve truth, and science is bothered with this, and they talk in a way as if the truth itself is disassociated from any moral sense. It's just truth is valuable in and of itself. But Nietzsche would argue against this. He would say, no, this inclination to truth is a moral judgment. You say that truth is good. And insofar as you're saying truth is good and you move towards it, you've made a moral judgment. Now, he also then argues that if you do this and and especially if you're living without genuine faith, and you're like in the aphorism of the madman, he talks about this madman that comes down from the mountain. He's talking to the people and he's saying he's looking for God, and the people are laughing at him. Then they don't take this notion of God seriously anymore. Nihilism has taken them. The disbelief has taken them, but they haven't even realized it yet, and they're just mocking this man. Now, insofar as this is the case, where you have Richard Dawkins or whoever it is talking about truth as being a value in and of itself, what you have is truth ends up undermining itself. That is, the highest value devalues itself, as he says in that next quote. And it can do in a number of ways. One way, truth undermines trust. And the way it does that is that truth reveals corruption. So in a particular society, say you've all of the politicians, this may speak to some people, especially today, all of the politicians have become corrupt. They're all a bunch of liars. The media's, for the most part, corrupt. And truth has become not so much a concern for them. And so they perpetrate propaganda. They lie. They do what they can to get what they want. They are out to benefit themselves and no one else. Now, insofar as truth reveals this, and this truth is made or brought to light, and the people in general know that their trust has been undermined, that these people have been lying to them the whole time. Now, if they find out that the community at large has been lied to and that their trust has been undermined, this trust brings to light that they lived for so long thinking they had truth, and because their trust has been undermined, they lose the hope that they can achieve truth any further. They've been lied to for so long and believed it. What else do they believe in that turns out to be a lie? And you've got notions of the post-truth era that sort of derive out of this. Like, people have been lied to so many times by people who are supposed to be in places of authority, people who are supposed to be able to trust, that people just lose confidence in the ability to gain truth, even when they've achieved it. So, they might actually be on a truth. They might have been told something that is true, but they fail to be able to accept that because of the fact that they've been lied to so many times. They lose any ability to trust anyone anymore. And you see this with things that are quite, in terms of the science, it has been established, like climate change, like things that to do with the fact that the Earth is changing and we are having some sort of contribution towards that. Now, what are the answers? I don't know. That's a whole conversation in itself. We don't need to get into that. But there are problems occurring. There are things happening. Pollution. We do have problems with pollution. When I was traveling, everywhere I went, regardless of how remote you would find yourself, you'd find a bleeming Coke bottle on the floor, a packet of crisps, a cigarette packet. Like, how is it that crap is getting to the middle of nowhere? There's an issue here. There's a lot of stuff floating around in the ocean. We're being extremely wasteful. These are issues, and this is real. And some people have gotten to a point where they can't even accept this anymore, and they just kind of accept whatever they want to, or they're being fed whatever they want. Fake news this, fake news that, and truth. We end up in this post-truth era where truth becomes whatever they want. So that's truth undermining itself. Truth was one thing that led to the erosion of trust, which leads to a lack of confidence in the ability to attain truth anymore. There's other ways of doing it. Truth, to some degree, for example, you look at the world and you see there's all these different moral systems. That's a particular truth. There are different moral systems in the world. You've got different ethical frameworks and different communities and different cultures have different ways of approaching things. One part of the world thinks polygamy is okay, another part of the world doesn't. One part of the world thinks it's fine to imprison a huge portion of its population for minor crimes. The other part of the world doesn't think that's okay. You've got a huge variance in moral systems. That's a truth. And this itself can lead certain people to take on these moral relativist positions, or in even more extreme cases, moral nihilist positions, where they deny truth altogether. And so you have truth undermining the concept or the idea of morality, which then further leads to the undermining of the idea of truth altogether, if it's discovered that truth is underpinned by notions of morality. So if truth undermines morality, if truth is a moral function, if you negate morality, you then negate truth, which led to this quote unquote discovery that morality is a false idea or an error. It's referred to in ethics as an error, as error theory. It's just another way of referring to moral nihilism. That is the denial that when you're talking about moral opinions, that they are facts. In fact, they refer to it as an absolute error in language, and there needs to be other ways of approaching it. And that would be this notion of the highest values devaluing themselves. So that is, there are some mechanisms within the process of valuing something that ultimately leads to its own destruction. It's like the man that kicks his own legs from underneath him. And inshallah, in the weeks to come, we're going to go into this in a lot more detail. So like I said, in week 2, inshallah, we'll go into the causes for nihilism. In week 3, we'll go into the effects. So we'll speak more specifically with regards to the 4 distinctions that you can find, or the 4 categories within nihilism. So like epistemological nihilism, existential nihilism, cosmic nihilism, and moral nihilism. And then in the final one, we'll go into a possible response to it from an Islamic perspective. And inshallah, potential tools in order to overcome nihilism altogether. So that is the end of the slide. I do apologize that it's taken so long. Let's have a look. How long have we been on? Is there a way of finding out on here? I can see that the slide has been running for nearly 2 hours. I don't know. It's not saying anything in particular here. So yeah, so if anyone has any questions so far, I would be happy to take them for the time being. So you should be able to ask your questions in the app that you're using to listen to this. So I'm just going to have a look through these. So someone has asked, salam wa alaikum salam, could you send us the link where the recordings will be uploaded? So the recordings, inshallah, should be going on to the Sapience Institute YouTube channel, and they should also be available on the Sapience Institute website. So if you check them out, they should be uploaded there. Do we get the slides later on? Yeah, you can have them later on. I think I'm not too sure if they're going to be made available on the website, or there might be like a file link or something. But if you do want them, do send me an email, and I can forward them to you. Just simply say, can I have the slides for lecture 1 or lecture 2 or whatever, and I can send them to you. If you email me at contact.ponderingsoul@gmail.com, and I can get them to you if there's no other way of you getting them. So someone else has asked here, the animals just simply exist. Yes, they do, by fulfilling their fitrah. It's the same with the human beings. We are created to serve our creator by learning who he is. As long as our fitrah isn't clouded, then you start questioning yourself. Yeah, exactly. So this is again a way of explaining how the human being can be considered distinct from the rest of creation, or the rest of the animal kingdom. Because we have these things where we get ourselves into a pickle because we're just thinking too much. And if you're an observer from the outside and just looking, you're like, what's going on here? This person, let's say an alien species hypothetically came down and was to look at all of the creatures and just to find the human beings en masse. So I gave a particular number. It was like 800,000 people killing themselves every year, up to 4 times that amount attempting and failing to kill themselves. And you're looking at these numbers, which are a large amount of numbers, and trying to figure out what's going on here. It's like half of it, or probably the majority of it, is caused by the internal processes, the thought processes that these people come through and don't necessarily communicate to the external world. Half of the problems of suicide could probably be resolved if there was someone equipped to be able to talk to them and help them overcome the issues that they're going through. So yeah, it's an interesting point. Someone still says, Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum salam, and Wafiq. Could you recommend some books on this topic? So with regards to nihilism, there's so Nietzsche's wrote extensively on it, but Nietzsche is a bit of a weird reader. A bit of a weird person to get into, especially if it's the first thing you're going to start engaging in. Leave that with me. I'll try and get it in the bibliography sections of my essay. There's usually a lot of work being referenced there, which touches on this subject. So if you read my essay that's been published on the Sapience Institute website, scroll to the bottom, there's a bibliography, and there's a lot of further reading on the subject that you'll find there. There's also like a very short introduction book by the Oxford publishing group called The Meaning of Life. So it's a very short introduction, The Meaning of Life. That probably will touch on it briefly. Unfortunately, they've not actually got a book on nihilism yet. Maybe I'll try and get them to let me write that one. Inshallah, make dua. But there's a good introduction to Nietzsche, written by one of my old teachers, actually, called Starting with Nietzsche by Ulrich Hasse. So that covers pretty much all of Nietzsche's work, and it goes into it very briefly. It's like a short introduction. And there is a subchapter in there that discusses the idea of nihilism. And that was a pretty good book to kind of start grappling the ideas that Nietzsche puts forward. But again, I would preface this with just giving you a push to make sure you establish your foundations in fiqh and akida before you start venturing out into any of this, because philosophy in and of itself is very nihilistic. And one thing that students of philosophy often end up having to deal with is some form of existential crisis. It's quite common, so much so it becomes like a sort of meme within the philosophy community, that like you'll just be brushing your teeth and you might have an existential crisis. But yeah, and one of the reasons is that people often, they'll put on philosophy hat, forgetting philosophy is supposed to be a tool in order to discover truth, in order to it's a practical tool. The whole aim of it in the first place was to discover the best way of living, to figure out the answer to the big questions with regards to life, with regards to you, with regards to the best way of organizing as a society. But very often people will put that hat on and forget to take it off, and they'll live in it. In the same way, it's like someone who picks up a spanner and then will refuse to put it down and wants to use it for everything. The philosophy has its place. Philosophy is brilliant with many things, but if taken to an extreme, it can lead people into a labyrinth they can't get out of. They can dig holes too deep and forget to bring a ladder with them, and being able to get out of that. And it does lead people into severe skepticism, and I would say in certain circumstances to nihilism, where they just feel completely not confident that you can really completely overcome anything. And people suffer from this, and it's quite common. So a lot of the famous philosophers end up uh, suffering greatly because of philosophy. Nietzsche, whether there's debate about what caused his problems, but he was supposed to do this huge crescendo. Like his final publication was supposed to be this big final thing that was going to destroy Christianity. He called it the Antichrist. Or the book actually, I think, had a grander name than the Antichrist. I think the Antichrist was supposed to be a chapter in this book, but he didn't even get to finish that. He was crippled by something mentally, and the last thing that was recorded of him was that he saw a horse being beaten by its owner. So it was like a horse and carriage in the street, and the horse was being beaten. And Nietzsche broke into tears. He ran over, he cuddled the horse, and said, "I know your pain." And then he never spoke again. And he was instituted for 10 years of his life. His family had to look after him. And he never spoke a word again. And he lost his mind. And there's debates whether or not it was actually maybe syphilis or something. Like he had an STI from some encounter with a prostitute when he was younger. And so there is debate as to whether or not it was maybe his madness was linked to that. But there's also a huge possibility that it was a result of his work, and especially with delving into the ideas and concepts of nihilism, because it's quite a grand subject, and it can be a very dangerous one. So just be careful delving in this. Like I say, I would always recommend making sure you have your foundations in Aqidah sorted, so you've got something to stand on, so you've got a footing before you go moving out into anything else. Next question: how can we convey this concept in a more friendly manner with our friends, as it's not something discussed, especially on campuses, despite the rampant depression and suicide prevalent? Good question. You have to pick and choose your moments. You can't just drop this in randomly, like, "Hey, you want a cup of tea?" Yes, and nihilism. No, it's usually you've got to kind of deal with each person individually, and you'll have to pick up on a cue and squeeze this in ever so gently. People, when they're suffering from this, not necessarily comfortable talking about it or 100% wanting to. One of the biggest feelings is just this feeling that of being unable to communicate the problems that you're experiencing. Sometimes empathy can go a long way. So you can ask someone how you're doing, and they might give you a bit of a clue. I've been struggling a bit, or a bit of a headache, a bit stressed, a bit this. And you could probe them on that and say, "Well, why? What's going on? Is everything all right?" And they might start to open up a bit more, and then you can relate to them with empathy and say, maybe you've experienced similar things. And usually a good way to kind of work your way into that is to tell them about. You say, you remind me when I was younger, or a while ago in this particular part of my life, I went through a really, really, really low point, where I was struggling a lot. I felt unable to communicate with people. I felt like no one would understand me, and I was very much alienated or isolated from the world and the community around me. And because of that, I suffered a lot. I went through depression. I went through this, and for me, this is true. And obviously, it's a lot more difficult if you haven't had these experiences. Maybe you can work on some sort of trust that they have with you. That might help. And if they trust you, they might be more willing to open up, even if you can't relate to the problems that they're having. And they may attempt to communicate with you. You try to work through them problems. But yeah, so you've just got to kind of find openings and work your way in there. Be patient. You don't want to just jump straight into a deep end or drag them in, especially with this subject matter, because they're already kind of probably suffering from anxiety and things like that. So it's just a case of taking slow and steady steps with them, and only going as far as maybe they're willing to. You don't necessarily want to force people into a conversation they're not comfortable having. Another option is sometimes to also try to seek professional help. So there are people specifically trained in order to help people deal with things like depression, etc., and to overcome certain issues. So that's another thing you could do is obviously try to get them professional help, while simultaneously being there for them. Obviously, you need to balance it, because it can be quite contagious as well. If you're dealing with someone who's really suffering from depression and you're trying your hardest to help them, and maybe they're unwilling to accept the help or unwilling to get it, they can drag people down with them rather than the people trying to help them being able to pull them up. It can have the opposite effect sometimes. So you want to be careful and make sure you've secured certain safety devices in place so that if they try to drag you down, that you're not just going to go tumbling with them. That is obviously if you're struggling as well to a particular degree, maybe try to focus on sorting your own issues out as well, before you try to kind of help people get out of their stump or their low points. You need to get yourself into a more confident and happy position so that you're able to lift people up to something. You can't do that if you're not up anywhere to help lift people. So that would probably be the best way of doing it. Patience is the key, and listening half of the time, and probing, so questioning and trying to get them to kind of open up to you. You can kind of explore it with them. Again, with regards to as deeply as I've gone into it, maybe you can introduce them to the lectures. So just send them a link, see what they say. If they watch it, that might open up a conversation as well. You can start discussing the things that you've listened to today, etc. What is our relationship to subjectivity as Muslims? Barakallahu fikum. With regards to as Muslims, I think whether you're Muslims or not shouldn't really matter. The relationship that the human being should have to subjectivity is one of interest. That is, that simply hearing that something is subjective shouldn't make you think that there's nothing to learn from that, or that there is no value to it, or that it's synonymous with this idea of falsity, or that it should be disregarded, dismissed, put in a cupboard, swiped away. The relationship with subjectivity is a complex one. There's much more to it than meets the eye. Like I say, even the objective is derived from intersubjectivity. That is, everyone is having particular experiences, and we can derive them and abstract them, and we come up with these ideas of that which is the case independent of any mind. It's a bit of a weird statement to make, because that information was only achieved because there was a mind. So how you can then move on to this idea of independent of the mind, we're kind of what we're basically saying is that there is this external world, we're taking it for granted that it exists, and I think it's a reasonable assumption to make, that this is all isn't just in your head, but we take for granted that the external world exists, and it exists independently of individual human minds. We take each subjective experience of a collection of people, and then we abstract what is common throughout. We repeat tests, and what keeps occurring in each of these experiences, all of them without deviation, we're going to refer to that as objective. We're going to say that is independent of the mind, even though we've derived it off the mind. So the objective is still related to the subjective. The subjective is related to the objective insofar as you need to objectify the subject in order to come up with a concept of what subjectivity is, or what qualities are subjective. Let me turn the slide off, actually, it'd probably be better. So there's a relationship between these two concepts. It's not a dichotomy, they're not one or the other. Often the case, it's very layered. You might have subjectivity within objectivity, within subjectivity, within objectivity. And you've got to be aware of this relationship so that you can explore it properly. And what that means is that the relationship you have with subjectivity is a nuanced one, where you approach it with an open mind. You want to look at it and to see what you can abstract from that, because it's often the case that there is objective that can be abstracted from a number of subjective experiences. So you want to approach it carefully. Don't just take this, that's subjective, that's a load of crap, and I'm not going to listen to it. I'm going to just assume that there's no wisdom to be taken from this because it's been categorized in the subjective box. and so I'm just going to forget about it and move on. And this also means that, you know, like, people might overvalue certain things that are objective. Like, all right, certain facts might be the case, but what purpose or what use are they? Like, what can I do with them? So, okay, that car was moving 30 miles an hour. So what? That's objective. Do I really need to value that tiny piece of information? Like, what you know, what wisdom can I derive from that particular objective fact? There are many objective facts that are just completely irrelevant, or serve no purpose, or you know, knowing them is useless. You're not going to gain anything from it. The world won't gain anything from knowing it. You know, like certain information, like how many hairs are on every human body. Like, that's an objective fact that no one is ever going to need to know. Like, who gives a crap about how many hairs are on every human being? Like, you know, this valuing of objectivity is sort of this absolute value is just quite demonstratively absurd. That's not to say that most people, I think even people who do value objectivity a lot, when they, you know, if you say this to them, they're not going to say, oh, well, we should know that anyway. I think they're going to admit that there are certain objective things that we don't need to know. But it's basically, you offer these two counter examples. There are subjective things that are important, mainly because we abstract objective from collections of subjective experiences, and with that, there are objective facts that just serve no purpose or are completely useless. And then the opposite, there are objective facts which are incredibly important, and there are subjective facts which just, or subjective bits of information that serve no purpose or are completely useless to know as well. But it's there should be nuance between the two. Someone said, Assalamu alaikum ahi wa alaikum salam. I once asked my teacher if objective morals actually exist without having to refer to a creator, Allah. He then said that Kant was the closest to prove that it was objective. Can you please shed light on that, inshallah? So I really am not too fond of a lot of the typical conversation or the typical dialogue that you find with these ideas of objective or subjective morality. Now, for example, you could say that the law is an objective, quote unquote, morality. If by morality you mean a notion of what is good and what is bad or evil, what you should do, how you should act, how you should not act, there is an argument to be made that, well, you know, it might be arbitrary. You might not be able to completely justify the whole thing, but it would still count as an objective morality to some degree, insofar as you could say that this law objectively exists. You know, there is this book that we call the British law, and that book exists independently of any mind. And within there is a code on how we should all live our lives. If anyone breaks that code, we put them in prison, or you know, do whatever we're going to do to them. And if people obey it, then we leave them alone. There's a way of describing that as objective, insofar as it exists independently of any particular human mind. There's a way of describing it in many ways. It's not particularly useful to talk of morality in these weird ways, and there's a lot of nuance that goes into it, because like I said, I'm not 100% fond of the concepts of objective. I guess maybe the words people might be looking for is absolute, binding completely regardless of time, place, or person. That might be more of a better way to respond to it. But even then, you know, it can get even more complex. So can you have a law that's conditional? And if there is a conditional law, should you describe this as subjective or objective? So if alcohol is permissible at one time and it's not permissible at another, does that make the idea that this is changed, because this has changed, does that make it subjective or relative? Or can you look at it as an objective conditional? That is, under a particular condition, this output will be considered to be true. Under a different condition, so with different inputs, under a different context, this output will be considered true. You know, the general theory of relativity, the speed, the general theory of relativity is an objective set of laws which contain things which are relative to certain circumstances. Just because there is a relativity or a change in context leading to different outputs, it doesn't follow from that that it's not objective. So like I say, it's a very deep subject to get into, one that could probably do a whole series on its own, with regards to morality and the different approaches to it. With regards to whether Kant got the closest to it, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I've read his book, The Critique of Pure Reason, and he ends up moving towards this. It's going to take too long to go into it, so it's probably better I don't try to answer it absolutely. But like I say, I think the best answer to this at the moment would just be that looking for answers to, can you have objective morality without God? There are answers to that where you can say yes, but that doesn't mean that it's satisfying. It doesn't mean that they have justified it well enough, but it might still be referred to as objective. Because what does objective mean? It just means that it is the case independent of the human mind. Independent in what way? Like when you say, if you're trying to take some sort of moral realist position and say that morality does exist where? It exists how? And do you mean by that it exists independently of the world? Like, is it existing because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it? Would that make it objective? And if it doesn't exist with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what else is left? Maybe you can posit something like Plato's forms, where you have this other dimension, blah, blah, blah. They can bring these hypotheticals, and you can maybe refer to it as objective. But then again, it's like, well, how then do you go on to prove this other dimension with these forms existing? It's like, well, insofar as they do, if they did exist, then we could call that objective. If they didn't, then we might have an issue there. But then we could just refer to the law as it's written down as objective. We can come to, and because this is the thing you've got to remember, before I said the objective is an abstraction of the intersubjective. Now, if the objective facts of the world that we, our exploration of that we call science, if all of that and everything we refer to as an objective fact in that way is abstracted from intersubjective experiences, then why couldn't law act in a similar way? But then just because you can do that and refer to it as objective, because it is, does that necessarily mean that it ought to be followed, or that it is of value, or that it is significant? Not necessarily. The concept of objective doesn't contain necessarily these notions of ought. This kind of links to Hume's problem, the deriving oughts from an is. So just because you can talk about a particular fact in the world, it doesn't mean you can necessarily derive a necessary action that should follow from that. This is a distinction between descriptive and prescriptive statements. You can't move from descriptive premises, where you just have only descriptive premises, to a prescriptive conclusion. So talking about morality in the sense of it being objective, I think is a massive oversimplification. And even if the answer to that was that you could get something close to it without God or without a creator or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it doesn't follow from that you've gained a point, or that you've won something, or that you've put something forward that is superior or worthy to follow. But like I said, there's probably a huge conversation that could be had on this, and quite an interesting one. The next question: meaning is intention. It's related to intention, so it's not like meaning is exactly the same as intention. Meaning contains intention, or can contain intention, and there's different notions of intention as well. So in terms of phenomenology, or the school of philosophy known as phenomenology, intentionality is this directedness of consciousness. So when we're talking about the intentionality of an experience, we're talking about that which the experience is aimed at. So if you're focusing on your computer, the intentionality of your consciousness, what it's intentionally directed towards is the computer. If you're daydreaming, you're not really listening to what I'm saying, or you're not focusing on your computer, and you're thinking about that time you're on a holiday in Egypt and you went scuba diving. The intentionality there, that what you are directed towards, is the idea of you being on holiday. So that's what intention means there. And so with relation to meaning, meaning has an intentionality. That is, it has a something that it is directed towards. When you're looking at words, the meaning directs you to the meaning of it directs you away from the words to that which it represents. And then you've got intention as intending to do something. So if I write something down, there's a meaning in that writing, and I intend to communicate a particular thing to you. So it's another way of understanding intention. But it's not, I wouldn't say meaning is intention. I would say meaning contains intention. And then in a variety of different ways as well. Why is picking at one's words a problem? It's not necessarily a problem, but it can be. Like when you're talking to someone and they're looking at your words and they focus so much. Like, have you ever said a word so many times that it stops sounding like a word? And like, you know, or been like, I've had that experience a lot where I've said a word over and over and over, and it's like, that doesn't even sound like. And even with simple words like who or how, who, hey, WHO, and then you look at the way it's written and you're like, well, that looks weird. That doesn't. Or there might be a bigger word and you write it down and you're like, wow, is that how you spell it? Yeah, that really looks strange the more you look at it. Now, when someone picks at words too much, they lose the context. When you zoom in and on a small part, you forget the big picture. And so when you're communicating with someone, and if someone's too busy focusing on a particular word, it's very possible they can lose the context of what that word was meant to represent, or the place in the conversation as a whole. You find this in conversations about the apologetics regards to the Quran. So someone looks at the Quran and they see kill the disbelievers, and they look at that particular quote and they go, look, and they're so busy picking at this particular sentence, or these three words, kill the disbelievers. They look at that, they fail to see what it's embedded within. They fail to see the context of the whole thing. They fail to see elsewhere where it talks about the context of this particular verse, talking about the Battle of Badr, that the people were surrounded. It's not to be understood as an absolute statement that everyone who is not Muslim should be killed. That is not the intention of this statement. But someone picking at the words and just focusing in on that particular thing loses that context. And insofar as they refuse to move beyond the words, they can't get the context. Insofar as you isolate these on their own, you can't move beyond that. And you're left with this notion, kill the disbelievers. What else can you do with that when you're looking at it on its own? If I was to spray paint that on the wall with no other context, then that's going to be extremely problematic. But alhamdulillah, that's not what the Quran is. The Quran isn't just spray paint on a wall with three words out of context. The Quran is a whole book with many statements, with many verses, many chapters. And insofar as you have the whole book, you can't miss the context. You can't take away from that we should be going out and just you go around asking people, are you a Muslim? And if they say no, then you do the unthinkable. You can't take that when you read the Quran. And this is the issue. And we have this problem, not even just with the Quran, but when communicating with people in a general sense. And it's incredibly frustrating when they pick at your words or just even at your sentences and refuse to take in what they meant in place with regards to the paragraph or with regards to the particular argument. We can probably take we can take the fact someone could cut this video now and take that moment where I've quoted the Quran where I said kill the disbelievers. They could just take that quote and post that on the internet and say, oh, look, Yusuf said this. That would be picking at the words. or picking at a sentence. And it's obviously going to lead people astray to thinking I believe or command something of the people that I did not command. So that would be why picking at words is a problem. In your journey to Islam, was a search for meaning the bigger reason to accept Islam, or the search for truth? What I mean by this question is sometimes for some people meaning is more important than truth. So if any religion idea give them the meaning they search for, they will accept it regardless if it is true or not. No, so for me, it wasn't primarily just the meaning. So I was focused on what was true. And out of this, meaning arisen. So if it was only meaning, I dabbled in things like Buddhism. I dabbled in things like the New Age religions, Hinduism a little bit. And I was getting a sense of meaning from this, but I wasn't getting a sense of truth. And so although when I was in these ideas, like I say, I was getting this meaning from it. I felt like I was driven by some sense of purpose, by some goal, by something of greater value than myself. But I just didn't see truth in it. There was too many contradictions. It was just too problematic for me in terms of its content and the truth values of the propositions it was putting forward. And when I was reading into Islam, I was getting a grand sense of meaning from this, but along with that, it was accompanied with truth. So I was finding truth in the notion of Tawheed and a consistency which I didn't find in notions of polytheism, pantheism, or these other theisms. And alhamdulillah, so the fusion of these two things sort of led me closer to that closer to Islam and draw me to it. While the falsity of these other things, even though I was getting senses of meaning out of them, were pushing me away from it. And meaning, something I think, for me at least, it needs meaning in order to draw you towards it. But it needs meaning with truth. And insofar as you have one and not the other. So if you have truth without meaning, you're not going to go towards that. And you've got to keep in mind we're finite beings, and having access to certain truth it doesn't mean you have access to the absolute truth. You don't have access to the biggest picture. And you can get this or a sense of this when you're talking to someone who's unconvinced of theism because of something like the problem of evil, for example. They have access to particular truths. That is, there is evil in the world, or they have experienced a certain amount of suffering, or they know people who have suffered, and then they think from that they can move to the conclusion that God necessarily doesn't exist because X, Y, Z. The premise is that there is suffering, etc. That's a truth. But to me, like, it can be often quite a meaningless statement, because half of the time they're judging a lot of these notions based on arbitrary preferences that they haven't really justified completely. Like, oh, I think that if there was a God, that he wouldn't allow any evil or suffering at all, that the world would just basically be paradise straight away. Why do you think that? How do you know that if there was a God, that would be the necessary outcome? How can you say that explicitly? Oh, well, because he would be good, and if he was good, he wouldn't allow suffering. It's like, well, no, there is a conception or an idea as to why there could be suffering. There could be there's all sorts of arguments that have been given in the fields of theology. There's the soul building theologies, that the existence of evil, there's the comparison notion. So in order to appreciate something, you need to experience its opposite. In order to appreciate light, you need to experience dark. In order to appreciate, and you get, for anyone who's fasted, in order to really begin to appreciate food again, you need to starve a little. And in Ramadan, you go through that process of becoming very hungry, and out of that becoming hungry, you get a profound gratitude for food again. And alhamdulillah, it's one of the reasons I absolutely love Ramadan, and I can't wait for it, because once Ramadan's not been around for a little bit and you've been kind of spoiled and you get to eat what you want when you want, you cease to value the food anymore because you just got it in abundance. However, having experienced its opposite allows you to appreciate it. And so the same thing with, and for me, growing up, I'd experienced evil, I'd experienced suffering, and this has really led me to be able to really appreciate the goodness I have in life. And then some might argue, well, what about the afterlife? You know, there's going to be constant pleasure there. How then does that work? As well, in the afterlife, you're going to have constant pleasure, but you're going to have a notion that you experienced suffering. You're going to have a memory that you had a life. You've already gone through pain. You've already gone through death. You've gone through all of these. So you now have something to compare it to, and you can obviously the paradise, our bodies aren't necessarily going to be constructed in the same way. But there's basically, in short, there's lots of arguments that you can give which can explain why there might be suffering and why there might be evil. And people might neglect them or say that they're not sufficient, although I would argue that they argue it very well, and I'm very convinced by them. But it's basically, to return back to your question. Sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there. It's not just about truth independently; it's truth and meaning. Let's have a look. So I've been going for about 2.5 hours. I'm conscious that I've already gone quite a long time. So I'm going to leave the questions here for the time being. Inshallah, I'll see if it's possible for me to take a note off the questions. And maybe I can do like a separate video if it's possible to save them and go through them, because it's quite a lot here now. So we'll leave it there for the time being. Jazakallah khair to everyone for attending. May Allah bless you all. And like I say, if you're watching on the YouTube channel, please leave comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, Sapience Institute. Keep an eye out on the website, sapiencinstitute.org. There's a lot more material being published. And if this is the only thing you've watched of Sapience, go check out the other things that they've been producing. There's a few other brothers involved in the organization that are doing some brilliant work, covering a lot of the major contentions in academia at the moment with regards to the existence of God and polemics concerning Islam. So make sure to follow on the social medias as well. So Twitter, there's a Sapience Institute Twitter account. Not 100% if there's one on Facebook, but I think there probably is. So do make sure to venture out there to check out that other material, and also subscribe to my channel, Pondering Soul. I do go into a lot of detail with regards to more of this, and obviously you can engage with me there. I do live streams from time to time. So check that out. Follow me on Twitter at Yusuf Ponders. Same tag, you'll find me on Facebook. And I have an email address, contact.ponderingsoul@gmail.com. Very busy at the moment. I've got a bit of a backlog of emails that I still need to respond to going back a few months. So you are welcome to email me. I generally do read them and then flag them in a particular color so that I've got a box of flagged messages that I need to respond to. I will, inshallah, get through to them when I've gone through this project in particular and the essay that I've got due coming on the end of May, which is going to be part 2 to the first essay on this subject. So yeah, feel free to email me. I'll read them. If it's not too hard to just kind of respond straight away, I will do, and I generally do. If the question has got too much going on in it and it requires a bit of attention, or if for whatever reason when I'm reading it, I'm already caught up with a number of things, I'll put it into this folder and respond to it at a later time. But I will respond to them, inshallah. So feel free to email as well. Even if it's just criticisms that I don't necessarily need to respond to, that would be appreciated, or any feedback. So even if I don't have the time to respond, or even if you frame it where I don't need a response, that would be great. I can check them out as well, inshallah. But other than that, I hope this has been of value to you all. I hope that you've learned something and that it's been of benefit to you. May Allah bless you all and guide you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.